I played this morning.
So did I.
Paddle.
We lost the first set in a tiebreak, and we were winning the second 4-2 when it stopped.
Enough paddle. It's not in the Olympics yet.
Let's go. Let's go.
Hello, welcome to Sport Unlocked from the Olympics. Joining me, Rob Harris from Sky News as ever, Tariq Panja from the New York Times, Martyn Ziegler from The Times. So we're in the final few days of the Olympics. How's your Paris experience been?
Well, mine has been generally very positive. A few hiccups along the way, but I think Paris have done a fantastic job, particularly inside the city. You know, the idea that you can have an Olympic village right in the heart of a city, and they're really, really impressed with that. Of course, there was the question marks over the Seine and the triathlon and the open water swimming. We can get to that later, but I think it's been a success from what Paris wanted to do, and it's been achieved.
Particularly when thinking back to Rio 2016, when it felt like in Barrow, we were in the middle of nowhere. The Copacabana was about 45 minutes an hour away from the Olympic Park. The venues largely there. Yes, it was great because in a way, when you get a park, there are so many things together, but here you really feel in the heart of the city.
Yeah, I think it's been a triumph in terms of using sort of existing venues, temporary venues, adapting things, not spending huge amounts of money on lots of new facilities. I think it's been really good. And I think Paris has been helped by the fact that you've got these sort of incredible visual things like the Eiffel Tower for the beach volleyball, the Champs-Élysées, all these like things which are so familiar, and just being able to use those has been great. There have been a few issues, haven't they? I mean, I think the opening ceremony, I think a lot of people think didn't really work, not helped because of the rain, and the pollution, of course, has been a big issue.
And just, of course, missed out Tokyo when we're discussing the recent Summer Games, in part because that was the pandemic, so it felt completely different. Although at times it can feel quite quiet in the centre of Paris. Often I've been around the Champs-Élysées at night and it's not exactly flooded with people packing into places. Although around sort of midnight, it can start to fill up in some of the restaurants, people leaving the venues, and you've got a sort of more of a late night buzz.
Yeah, I mean, the vibe around Paris has also been the fact that a lot of the population legged it. They left. They're in the south of France. They're off somewhere else because they didn't want to be in Paris during the Olympics for whatever reason. And I think some of those people might regret it because all of those events, it's once in a generation, once in 2 generations, their city is going to host something like this. And there is a bit of regret. I think some people have tried to come back. And in terms of the city being empty, it's also because I think the roads have been closed to traffic as well, mainly.
You made an interesting point on that. Are we sort of seeing a future maybe to how cities would be? I mean, you'll offend the car brigade who like their cars, but it's certainly given a different feel.
Yeah, and I think I did, but just to let people know, I mean, like these roads, these big French boulevards, they're open for pedestrians, and you can cycle, and hiring these bikes is extremely easy, and you can get to venue and see Paris in a way that you probably can't see before. But I did get some negative comments about that from taxi drivers in particular, saying all their fares have gone because of the roads, and some businesses. Because the tourists are in venues or in certain places are not going to restaurants that aren't as accessible as they might have been. So yeah, but I must say, from a personal point of view, it's been fabulous being able to cycle through a city without so many cars.
Yeah, I mean, unlike you two guys, I'm no longer in Paris, but when I was there, I was hiring those electric bikes all the time, and that was definitely the way to get around. I mean, I think the really heavy security, not surprisingly, I mean, touchwood, that's so far gone off without any major issues. But I think that's perhaps also affected the feeling and people wanting to go away, and maybe some residents also wanted to like cash in, rent their flats out, sort of quite understandably. So maybe that's another reason why. But I think generally, it's when you look back at it, people are going to say it's been a very successful Olympics.
Bit of praise for the Stade de France as well. Certainly leaving one of the main events there in the athletics virtually straight after it had finished and going straight towards the metro, that there was this smooth flow of people able to just go straight through, leave the stadium, straight onto the metro. A lot of concerns obviously raised about the venue in the past and whether it's more metros they're putting on or creating better people flow. Certainly a good experience there.
Well, I think I'm going to give myself some praise for that because when I went to the rugby sevens, which was 2 days before the opening ceremony, and I noticed people were leaving when they were leaving the stadium. About halfway through, there were queues to get out, and they were having their tickets scanned to get out. And I went and said to the security, "Well, why are you bothering doing this? This is creating unnecessary queues." And the guy said, "I really don't know, but I'm going to raise it at our meeting this evening and suggest we don't do it anymore." So there we go.
So available for event consultations.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Paris thanks you, Mr. Ziegler. Maybe a Legion d'honneur in your future.
You've got role in LA.
We've been very full of praise for Paris, and they deserve most of that. But of course, talking to people, the public who've been here, one of the gripes actually has been the food at the venues, the price of the offering and the quality of that. And given that gastronomy is one of the things France and the Parisians are known for, that has been quite disappointing if you talk to members of the public.
So this is normal service resumed about 6 minutes into the pod. All that positivity. Now time for the critique, and it's not just us; it's the athletes who have been complaining. Thea Lafond, who won the triple jump from Dominica, one of the great stories so far of these Olympics, first time medalist in gold. She was telling me that food's just pretty bland, and there are people who are from the village getting the deliveries into one particular gate.
We were some bland, Rob. I mean, Adam Peaty, the British swimmer, said this week that athletes had found worms in the salmon and things like that, which is pretty gross. And just generally, you're saying it just wasn't up to scratch. It's not high performance food. And Team GB's chief executive Andy Anson said that to me right even before the start of the game. Said that they've had to bring in another chef to provide food the British athletes at their own performance centre. So, despite all the sort of promises of Michelin star chefs in the village, that has been I think a big issue for the athletes.
Not an unfamiliarity with the cuisine. They didn't say when
protein, Rob, great source of protein. Maybe they should have supplied some frogs. They'd run out of eggs and chicken, I understand, at the start. So maybe some frogs would have balanced some of that protein deficiency as a result of it. But
and when some said the food was undercooked, it wasn't sort of steak tartare.
No, exactly. Yeah, that was it. That was the when Andy Anson talked about raw meat being served. That was lots of responses on social media. Has he never eaten steak tartare?
Well, it wasn't just the food. One of the big issues, the water. And I'm going to say, a lot of Olympic observers will often bemoan the media looking for issues with host cities, trying to drum up negativity. But I would say a lot of the issues we're now going to reflect on are genuine things. So the River Seine, they spent 1.4 billion euros trying to clean it up for the triathlon, the marathon swimming. And it's undeniable that there are issues with the bacteria in it. The readings are being measured by the day just to see if it will meet the threshold to be safe.
If you think this week that the training for the marathon swimming had to be cancelled because the levels of enterococci were too high, and then you actually realise that enterococci is a sign of fecal contamination. I mean, who really wants to swim in that? Even if it's like a little better the next day, it's you do feel it's not. It wouldn't be my choice.
Yeah, I did go to a lab that does some of the water testing, and that wouldn't have instilled confidence in me in terms of going into the water. However, visually appealing that it does look, and it's amazing. They were giving the numbers out at the daily briefings at one point, but then they stopped doing so. The Paris organisers, when you'd ask, it's like suddenly, oh, we don't have those.
Yeah, well, from the athlete's perspective as well, obviously Martyn's described the possibility of swimming in shit not being uh, something anyone would want to do. But there's also the fact that they're prepared for 4 years to be here. And don't forget, they kept missing those training days as well. They're supposed to have the day before, you're supposed to get the familiarization and test swimming in there, and they kept getting cancelled. And it's happened for the open water swimming as well. And I think Matt Lawton from the Times, he asked a question about this when he said, "Did you prioritize aesthetics for Paris over, athletic performance and for the swimmers?" And look, quite clearly they have. 1.5 billion euros has been spent on cleaning the Seine, and it's supposed to be some sort of legacy. But really, it's those pictures that we beamed all over the world of the Seine, the famous Parisian river, and all the backdrops along it, and being an Olympic course. They've just about done it. Let's see to what detriment in terms of athlete health.
Mention there the responses from the Paris organisers, and many who listen to us on the pod will have heard us talking about perhaps some of those events where we don't get the chance to ask on the record, those conferences where perhaps we expect press conferences that don't happen. Every day at these games, there is an IOC spokesman and a spokeswoman from Paris 2024 on a top table, on camera, on the record for an hour. You can ask them about lots of things, and some of the things that we'll get onto, very complex issues like the gender eligibility, the water, culture war battles over the opening ceremony. And there is the chance to do so. And the IC president, Thomas Bach, has also done 2 long press conferences so far. Anyone allowed in, anyone able to ask a question?
Yeah, nothing has been off limits in terms of what you can ask once you have the mic. Whether you get a straightforward reply or not is another question. But they have, as you said, Rob, been present, fronted this stuff up, and done it day after day here in Paris. That really compares favorably to the environment that we're so accustomed to, because we normally are at football, which is UEFA and FIFA events, where this is few and far between.
And apart from one misspeak by Thomas Bach on a technical issue on the gender eligibility, it's not like anyone's caught them out on something and they've, trying to catch them out on an answer. Yes, there have been some challenging questions, someone asking about investigations into Paris organisers and, quite detailed ones on that. But, they've taken them on and they've answered them.
Yeah, in fact, one of Thomas Bach's press conferences, the first one, there was, I think, somebody from FIFA was watching, and one of the FIFA media people, and said to me, "What do you think?" I thought it very good to have a press conference. FIFA should try it because it's they had their congress in Bangkok, didn't do anything at all. UEFA didn't have any press conferences apart from with their referees chief at the Euros, did they? So it's I think it's at least the IOC is showing that they're not scared to confront difficult topics.
Well, how not to run a press conference maybe from another part of the games, the sidelines of the Olympic Games, the people very much not invited to the Olympics are the International Boxing Association officials. Tariq and myself ended up there at the press conference this week, and we've been to quite a few news conferences over the years, and this was bizarre, chaotic, farcical. Of course, at the heart of it, a very serious issue, and effectively them stoking the gender eligibility discussion around the 2 boxers who've had to face so much abuse by being having their gender eligibility debated in public.
It was the most remarkable event to ever been at. And just to set the scene as well, there must be about 100 journalists from all over the world, cameras, live news crews, and it was a very hot room. It was delayed for about an hour and a half, waiting for a stable communication with Umar Kremlev, the Russian president of the International Boxing Association, to come in via video link or Zoom from Moscow. his eventually appeared behind the three men on the dais, chief executive, a medical official, and a coach's official. And he was, his presence was like looming over the entire thing. The screen was enormous. His face was over the screen. Alongside him was quite a lot of Christian iconography. And Rob, this man, he launched into very, very, very long answers that sort of fluctuated between talking about the cases of these two women and their eligibility, and then pretty much ad hominem attacks on Paris 2024, on the IOC, and particularly Thomas Bach over the opening ceremony, and he called him all sorts of names. What did you? Where did we kind of end up? Did we get the answers? I felt like we left with more questions than answers.
Yeah, provided no clarity. In fact, there was conflicting information about the testing that took place on the boxers. Now, we can get into more of that in a second. Maybe, Martyn, one for you. For those who aren't familiar with the International Boxing Association, Umar Kremlev, to explain why they are banished from the Olympic movement, why they're not organising the boxing here, why they are such pariahs after sort of years of investigations. This is classically one of those stories that has been bubbling around for some years, and the whole issue of will boxing be banned from the Olympics, but only because it explodes in this way at an Olympics does the whole world suddenly take notice of all these governance issues.
Yeah, they were sort of de-recognised by the International Olympic Committee in 2019 after a series of corruption scandals, match fixing, governance issues, and since then they've effectively been taken over by Russia, which is banned from the Olympics. So Umar Kremlev is a associate of Vladimir Putin. He's funded by Russia, and it's still sort of got power in certain parts of the world. Although like USA, Britain, some of the European countries have broken away and formed a sort of rival body, it still has some sort of power and still holds these world championships. And that's what led to this situation where two female boxers were declared eligible to compete in the Paris Olympics, but it turned out they had been disqualified from last year's World Championships after failing what the IBAA said were gender eligibility tests. Now, am I right, guys? Kremlev said both they were tested for testosterone and then they had chromosome tests. But other people in the IBA said different.
Yeah, they challenged the fact there were chromosome tests, weren't there?
Yeah, the Greek doctor, he described it as blood test karyotype testing, a type of genetic testing. And they said, they had male, they said, using their words, I felt it was also crude, the type of language they were using. They said they were male without providing any of those details. And again, one talked about testosterone, others talked about the chromosomes. It was all over the place, wasn't it? I mean, the whole thing was just a mess. And it really, given the sensitivity of the matter, it was handled so appallingly.
It was, and of course, the two people at the heart of it are the female boxers, Lin Yunting and Iman Khalif, who are medal winners now here at the Olympics. Intriguingly, the fact that they were first tested in 2022 at the World Championships, and this is something I pressed on why then they took until 2023 to test them again, and only disqualified them once they were on for medals. And with Khalif, she'd just beaten a previously unbeaten Russian, who then, because the result was annulled, then maintains that unbeaten record. No clarity apart from the fact that, well, they claim they had to wait until the next championships to be able to test them. And something on the doctor who was on the panel as well, the Greek doctor, who was, again, sort of railing against their gender. I think he was, calling them the males. And it was something that I made the point to him, well, as a doctor, don't you have a duty of care to your patients? What would you do if there was someone who came to you and she said she had potentially issues with their gender? Obviously, we don't know in this case if there are actually any gender issues, but they're mixing up terminology. It didn't sound like he would necessarily offer the best care to every patient or anyone who sought.
Ziggs, before you go in there, the other guy on the panel, a guy called Gabriele Martelli, who's head of the coaching commission or something of this group. He's got a Twitter page, and on his Twitter, he's got a video posted, and he describes in very exciting terms. This guy, he's got headphones on, he's got a microphone, so it might be a podcast or something. He described it as the case of the transgender athlete and the Chinese. Now, both of these things, as far as we're concerned, we are not correct. The IOC has said these athletes are not transgender, and Ting is from Taiwan, not China. Given that the political issues between China and Taiwan, you'd think a man who's been put on a podium to speak for an international sports body would get that right.
Yeah, you'd hope so. I mean, I just make a few points that I thought, because I mean this has become a sort of huge culture war issue. J.K. Rowling has been fulminating about it on Twitter. I think the IOC came into this slightly naively by saying, they still have the sort of gender eligibility rules that they've had since 2016. The whole sort of world has moved on since then. But I think actually to focus on what the IBA has said about these two boxers, as you say, there's so many conflicting statements, and nobody knows is the answer, because they've said some things which sort of conflict with each other, and B, if a lot of people are saying, why don't we do a straight chromosome test, and then if they're XX female, then they can box, and if they're XY male, even though they might have differences of sexual development like Caster Semenya, then they shouldn't be. Then they shouldn't. But I mean, genetics isn't as simple as that, and I know from my biology A level, for example, you can have a woman who has two X chromosomes and a Y. So she's mainly, majority female chromosomes, but then has a sort of extra Y. Now, and you can actually have the same. You can have an XYY. What do you do in those situations? Could that be a situation here? Nobody knows. So I think people are sort of leaping to conclusions and taking sides. And you should also point out that Khalifi has lost 9 fights before to women. So it's not as though she's sort of battering everybody left, right, and centre.
And of course, there are discussions to be had without probably specific people being discussed about safety when it comes to gender eligibility, because obviously there is a potential imbalance there. The separate discussion is around fairness in sport. We've discussed it in many other sporting contexts. Athletics has gone through this, obviously swimming as well. Safety comes more into play, obviously, in combat sports. But at the heart of this, obviously, we've not heard from Lynn or Khalif, and also there's an issue about discussing someone's private information in public. Obviously, this has been released by the IBA, and a lot of the languages, fairly pejorative, very loaded against them, isn't it? And we felt that in the press conference.
Yeah. No, we have heard from Khalif, I suppose, in the mixed zones, and she's talked about, she's just going to fight, she's going to be here, but the online abuse has been horrific. She had a teammate of hers at that press conference, funny enough. Into the second hour of that thing, there was an athlete from Algeria who was there representing her, and she talked about the toll it had taken on her friend. And then, in terms of what fairness, inclusivity in all of this, just to be clear, the IOC's rules, maybe they're not up to snuff and they should be changed and reviewed, and they may review them, says that, if a female is a female in the passport, they're eligible for female competitions. Of course, compared to all the other sports, it's the IOC that's in charge of boxing, because they've kicked the IBA out. I think it goes back, Rob, to the point that these boxers have been around for 6 years. The IBA didn't do anything, and suddenly, just when the Olympics is about to start, this controversy sort of rears its head, and makes people wonder whether this is part of that, that horrible bigger battle between the IBA and the IOC and these athletes and women's safety and all the rest of it is just collateral to that other issue.
And I think it confuses quite a few people, certainly those I speak to in Paris, why there is an inconsistency in the rules. I mean, first of all, on gender eligibility, I asked Sebastian Coe about this. World Athletics has gone through their own new guidelines, and he was very much saying that that's what's needed: clarity, clear rules. But the problem at Olympics is, it seems, it's every sport that organises its own sport, yet it is under the Olympics umbrella, and whatever happens, it's pinned on the IOC and the Olympics. So the suggestion is, should actually it be the IOC who oversees some of these bigger issues? I mean, you wouldn't expect, and although it is the case, the fact that different sports have their own integrity regulations when it comes to Olympics, match fixing, things like that. Surely there should be one size fits all. There should be policies that apply across all the sports. I mean, in terms of, I mean, just think, things like betting. Each sport will have its own regulations, won't it? Not necessarily an IOC one, but everything here is under.
Yeah, with this issue of sort of eligibility, the IOC. I remember in Tokyo, I think they did have some of their own rules, and since then they seem to have passed the buck almost completely to the different sports. And as you said, that creates a very varied landscape in terms of all manner of regulations. It is their event, but they say each IF, International Federation, they've got the experience of handling their events. They should be able to do it. But it causes confusion. Even with this, it took us a week, really, didn't it? It took us with this issue. We were struggling to get a clear answer, and we still are, clarity on the facts here over such a long time.
And another person who was at the top table at this press conference, which I've got to say, some of the chaos was, it was, arguing. He was taking you back into the room of this press conference and the chaos that was unfolding. We, as journalists, had to basically plead to be able to ask questions ourselves without the top table being the ones to be trying to dominate. When we had so many questions, then the technology was going chaotically. They allowed screeching noises in the room when all the sound went wrong, and they were sort of arguing, shouting. Then at the back of the room, one of Khalifa's friends, she was at the back, a fellow Algerian boxer who came to defend Khalif. But also another character was at the top table, the British Chief Executive and General Secretary of the IBA, Chris Roberts. Interesting character.
Yeah, he was a former soldier, was chief executive of Boxing Scotland. Though I'm not sure if he is Scottish or English. I think he might be English, but he
had a very broad Lancastrian accent, but maybe he'd lost his Scottish accent by then.
Yes, he's a guy. He was a sort of boxing judge for many years, and somehow ended up becoming involved. A lot of people in British boxing, surprise, I should say, ended up becoming the chief executive of the IBA. And I think some sort of eyebrows were raised, given the fact that he spent such a long career in the British Army, that he should have been tied himself so closely to a sort of Russian organisation. I mean, it has to be said also that there's been things about him in the past. He was named in the 2011 review by the retired Judge William Gage into in his 3-year inquiry into the death of a Iraqi detainee, Baha Musa, and the abuse of others in 2003. And Chris Roberts was actually named in this as having kicked and punched some detainees, although that was never held against him by the Ministry of Defence. He denied having done so, and was later, even after this review, was promoted and given the OBE.
You mentioned the Russian link there, and that was one of the more feisty. There were many feisty moments in that. There was one of the first questions was from a German reporter. He asked, "How much money is this federation getting from Gazprom?" And he asked Chris Roberts and the Greek doctor, I believe, how much they were being paid. The Roberts, in fact, I think he was quite annoyed by that question. He said it's none of his business, and attempted to move on. And Gazprom remains a prominent sponsor of the federation.
This is something I asked the IC president Thomas Bach about at the weekend. Also, a question I was able to put to Umar Kremlin via colleagues as well at the weekend about the Russian links. Now, it did prompt various people sort of almost replying to posts with sort of tinfoil, as almost like it was some conspiracy theory. But the reason to ask Thomas Bach about whether he thought this was part of Russian disinformation in some way, trying to disrupt the games, was because the IC themselves, before the Olympics, have been warning about Russian attempts to undermine the games. Microsoft put out a long statement too as well in June, with Russia effectively banned from competing as a team, certainly under its own flag, because of the ongoing war in Ukraine. So it was why Thomas Bach was asked about it. And Kremlin have actually called it a humiliation, the fact Russia is banned from competing as a team. So he did bring that into play. At the same time, a lot of very personal attacks on Thomas Bach when asked about it, and bringing it all back as well to the opening ceremony. And some of the Kremlin talking points have been railing against the insults to Christianity. Although it's got to be said, the Vatican themselves have apparently raised issues with the IOC about the opening ceremony, the depiction of the Last Supper, this diversity segment as well, Turkish President Erdogan. So it has become something beyond social media chatter that has kept going. In fact, the IOC did eventually apologise for anyone offended.
Yeah, the French Council of Churches as well, and it's no surprises that one Mr. Donald Trump also managed to stick his oar in as well, saying the same things. I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? These opening ceremonies, and you look the sort of artistic directors who put these things together. I think he spoke about freedom of expression, and we're showing in France, you don't need to worship. You can say what you want, and we wanted to demonstrate that. But at the same time, you can see some people might be offended, and perhaps maybe for some people it was too much.
Yeah, he. People have compared it. There's a scene, if you've not seen it, I'm sure it's on YouTube. But to compare it to the Last Supper, and he's insisted afterwards it was not a depiction of the Last Supper, the controversial scene. So it's up to people to make up their own minds. But given the world we live in and the stuff that is going on, Thomas Jolly, the artistic director, he has had countless death threats now, and the police in France are investigating those. It's amazing how quickly and how aggressively these things escalate, don't they? People take one side or another and just go to extremes.
Yeah, this part of what Thomas Bach was talking about, the sort of culture wars being appropriated around the Olympics. But that's a lot around the case around the boxing, the issues around the opening ceremony. But hanging over all this are the concerns about the integrity of the games and the Chinese swimming doping case, which we've heard from Adam Peaty, the British swimmer, raising concerns about it. And during the games, there has been a lot more renewed scrutiny over just how the Chinese authorities investigate.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was a brilliant example of how journalists are holding sport to account, because the World Anti-Doping Agency doesn't seem to be doing so. Nobody would know about these Chinese swimmers if it hadn't been for the New York Times, Tariq, and ARD, the German Hadjo Safelt, his investigations. So for me, it's sort of very well done for that, and I think it's just highlighted. It does seem to be one rule for one group of people, one rule for another, and I think the integrity issue is a really big one.
Yeah. No, thanks for pointing that out. And it's this, as you said, one rule for the other. What is it that we're saying that the Chinese have not been transparent in this? They have not ever come forward with these cases, whether it was a 23, whether it was some previous ones we disclosed, and then most recently last week, a swimmer here who won a gold medal in Tokyo was contaminated again after eating hamburgers and appeared in the relay squad here in Tokyo, in Paris. Again, this is about a level playing field where all anti-doping agencies and all athletes are treated the same, and they're just not. And of course, it leads to a lot of anger, a lot of frustration on the pool deck, as we suspected before the Olympics and as we've seen at the Olympics.
And quite interestingly, being such an international event, the Olympics, the press conferences as well, attended by a wide range of journalists. So we've got to hear the perspective of Chinese journalists as well, asking the IOC, railing against, particularly New York Times, American media, as they would see it, for releasing this private information around testing and bemoaning leaks of information.
Yeah, and to be honest, that's great. It's great to have the Chinese perspective in the room, and great to try and speak with Chinese media as well, and Chinese athletes in the mix. I mean, this is the first time at these championships that we've had a chance to talk to some of the swimmers who have been implicated and some who haven't as well. The Chinese, of course, have been tested a lot. Swimming told us there would be WADA, etc., etc. And the Chinese have said, it has been quite disruptive, the amount they've been testing. And they've said it's a bit unfair, all this focus. And they said, it's people are looking at them in ways they shouldn't, and they don't feel comfortable. But, this is all on the CHINADA and the WADA, I guess, for not being clear in the first place.
What about the USADA statement that was responding to the one by their Chinese anti-doping agency counterpart? And from China, they put out a statement attacking how the US handled the Martyn case. So what's all this about then? USADA are saying they won't resort to misdirection of propaganda, as they call it. But are there questions for the US on this? Who exactly is Martyn?
He's a track and field athlete here, and it's another contamination case. And the thing is, I think USADA's got an independent arbitration process, and this guy was cleared. However, WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, can appeal, and perhaps they should appeal this to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. But what USADA said is, look, at least we told you. We've published this. This is on the website. You know this because we've told you. And if you've got a complaint, if WADA doesn't like it, it can appeal, and maybe this guy will be banned. And that's part of the story here. The Chinese are saying this is a United States versus China issue. WADA have jumped onto that as well and talked about politicization and politics. But for me, it's all about transparency.
It is, and it's why actually when WADA held a press conference here, I also asked about American and British cases that, there's been a lot of scrutiny on. In fact, we discussed on the last podcast as well. So it was discussing those all broadly together. So it'd be interesting to see how this one does develop. Now it's being brought to even greater attention by the Olympics. So the Olympics are wrapping up. Who do you think one of the most visible faces has been around these Olympic Games, maybe beyond the athletes themselves?
Beyond the athletes, I was going to just on the athletes, we got Léon Marchand of France in swimming pool, 4 gold medals. Dupont in the rugby, the star. They've been these Olympics in a way have been sort of pushed up to a higher pedestal because of that home success. We saw it in London with all those golds for London, and the French have done very well. But there have been some very visible figures, Rob. Some who like to be visible through their use of social media. And one man in particular, we won't be surprised to see, has been lapping up all of that attention.
Yes, FIFA President Gianni Infantino, also an IOC member, certainly using the Olympics as a chance for a lot of networking, I would say. A lot of FA heads from around the world being pictured going through the Paris offices. He's been seen at a lot of venues, a lot of curated videos with him attending various sports. I think the BMX he was at as well, handing medals. He's been at the athletics a lot. Been with the some of the Indian Olympic officials quite a lot as well.
Yeah, he was, of course, at the famous Ambani wedding we talked about a few weeks ago, and Nita Ambani, an IOC member, is been in Paris hosting people at India House. India hoping to get the 2036 Olympics, it seems, and Infantino has been around that group, but also around another figure who I think has been a face of these games, Snoop Dogg. He has been absolutely everywhere. People have wanted to have their pictures taken with it. There is a picture of Gianni Infantino and Snoop Dogg, one of the other faces of the Olympics.
Yeah, maybe Jean is enjoying himself getting around to a lot of different sports away from football, as we do during the Olympics. We spend a lot of our time on football, so great getting down to the athletics track. Even got to see the hockey, the Dutch winning their hockey match the other day. And we've been so busy with the Olympics in this entire pod. We've just talked for 40 odd minutes, and in the midst of it all, these Olympics, we had the bid books for the 2030 and 2034 World Cups. Maybe it is one to get into another day, but the highlight for many was probably the Saudi bid book, in particular the plans to build a stadium in Neom, a few hundred metres off the ground?
A stadium in the sky from the Saudis. I suppose that's what we'll expect. And we'll talk, as you're right, Rob, there's a lot to unpack with that. We'll get into it on another day. But I must say, I wasn't surprised that it was announced right in the middle of the Olympics when everybody else is distracted. But, if you're listening, we haven't been that distracted. We will come back to this because that bid book is a remarkable piece of work. And, my takeaway is it's almost hard to see that book by the time the World Cup comes around. It's going to look very different, surely, than what was presented there.
Got to say, one thing that stood out to me, because it was a debate that dominated the entire build-up to the FIFA vote in 2010 for the 2022 World Cup and in the years afterwards. What date would the Qatar World Cup be? They haven't gone through any pretend. They haven't committed to a June-July World Cup in it. They've floated different dates, different options. They've talked about the heat. So I think it's just a lot more sensible as a discussion point. The fact they've thrown it out there, all various challenges with the Asian Games being at the end of 2034, the Ramadan dates as well floated in there as well. Interestingly as well, which I think we'll hear a lot more of in the years to come in the Gianni Infantino make football truly global discussion, is they nudge towards the fact, without saying it, why should football be beholden to the Northern Hemisphere calendar rather than the Southern Hemisphere, where the leagues take their breaks sort of around January time, sort of opening up the door for a World Cup then?
I think, to be fair, it was obvious if you're having the World Cup in that region, it has to be at that time of the year because people will fall, whether it's athletes or fans. Obviously, it has to be in winter. And look, there has to be enough flexibility. There's so many years between then when a World Cup can be held in the Southern Hemisphere safely, and certainly in the Middle East safely. Makes perfect sense. So, that is exactly what's going to happen there. But I just don't think the World Cup in 2034 will be as it has been presented there. Would I be surprised if a couple of other countries get involved? Not really. 48 teams in Saudi Arabia, 8 stadiums in Riyadh. Very unlikely.
That's a prediction, and of course, FIFA and Qatar. Well, FIFA tried to certainly move the 2022 World Cup around the region to be staged in other countries like the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain. If I remember, Qatar wasn't having any of that, and the plan got rejected. So it's one to analyse a lot more. Also, to get into the 2030 bid, you might have sensed Martyn had to go off and do some reporting. He's probably getting some far better stories than we are.
Hopefully we can hear all about them next week, Rob.
Hopefully so. Well, great to chat out here in Paris.
Yep, it's been a marvelous couple of weeks here, and I hope it all finishes safely.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for listening as well. As ever, you can message us at Sport Unlocked on X, Facebook and Instagram. But for now, goodbye.